All right. We're going to let Anne get started here in just a couple of minutes. But my name is Nikki Mazaka. For those of you who don't know me, I am a member of the Little Cities of Black Diamonds History Council. And welcome to our first live event of the Little Cities of Black Diamonds Fest 2021, from whence we came. The lovely Anne Kramer is going to be doing a couple of lectures for us today. And I just ask that everyone make sure that your cameras are off and that your mics are muted during the presentations. Yep, sorry, I was just admitting a few other people. And just make sure that you are keeping your mics muted and your cameras off during the presentation. And at the end, Anne will be taking some questions. And if you have questions that pop up afterward, we are having an historian Q&A after the event, after all of the lectures on Thursday at 6 p.m., which is another live event. But with that, Anne, I am going to let you take it away.
Thanks, Nikki. Well, and I want to thank the Little Cities of Black Diamonds Council for inviting me to speak. I've been kind of a member for many years and kind of in and out, but I'm an archaeologist by trade. I've been doing archaeology for over 40 years, the last 30 of which I spent on the Wayne National Forest, and was lucky enough to have a good career down there to build a cultural resource heritage program. And I'm now retired, so I have plenty more time to do this kind of thing. So tonight they've asked me, they kind of wanted to go over some of the cultures or peoples that were here prior to permanent settlement, like white settlement, so to speak. So we're going to start with the very first settlers in this area, and settlers, inhabitants might have been a better title than settlers. These we're talking about the prehistoric indigenous people who lived here in southeastern Ohio. And these are the general dates or time periods that archaeologists have defined in Ohio in general, and particularly in southeastern Ohio. And the main point that I want to make with this is that they were here starting 12,000 years ago, and we, meaning settlers, white settlers, European settlers, whatever you want to call that, we've only been here, living here for over 370 some years. So that kind of gives you a perspective of it's kind of mind-blowing to know that they were here that long. But there's still evidence of their presence. Anyway, but these are the general time periods as defined by archaeologists, professional archaeologists in the state, through radiocarbon dating and through the archaeological evidence, the different tools and the different types of sites and some of the different cultural adaptations. The other thing about southeastern Ohio is it's a little different than other areas because it was never glaciated. So the cultural adaptation to this area was a little different than some of the broader stream bottoms and stream valleys like the Scioto River Valley and such that are west of here. So the way they utilized and lived on the land was a lot different. So I mean, it's a rugged terrain compared to the flatter bottomlands of those valleys to the west, because the glacier never came here. It never came down into this area to smooth things out. So they didn't have a lot of level area to establish big villages. So they lived kind of on small level areas of ridge tops and stream terraces, and quite often lived within the rock overhangs or shelters within the ridge slopes, because they're kind of almost like ready-made houses. And they did have bury their dead in mounds, but the mounds here in southeastern Ohio are small earthen mounds on the ridge tops, and sometimes they would bury their dead within the rock shelters as well. But you don't see those large woodland burial complexes here. There just wasn't, the environment did not accommodate things like that here. The plains is about the only area in southeastern Ohio that we have something like that, and that's because that's a glacial terrace. And the variety, the area was fairly lush eventually. The variety of flint that's found here naturally, that outcrops here, provided plenty of good quality material for their tools, and the abundant natural resources only enhanced their living activities. So in general, that's kind of what the impression that I want to give is, that they were here for an awful long time before we got here. And the first period is termed by archaeologists as the Paleo-Indian period. The general thought is that they did migrate across the Bering Strait from Alaska when that was a continuous landmass. In general, they came east and south from there, and they migrated following big game like mastodon and elk and caribou. As the glacier retreated, they just followed the large game as it retreated. They were very nomadic, we think, and they had some preference for some good high quality flint to make their spear points out of. Other than the fluted point as shown at the top there, things like that, there's really very little tangible evidence of this cultural period in southeastern Ohio, unfortunately. So we kind of judge where they were based on where those are found. Then after the glacier retreated more and the area got warmer, the climate got warmer, the environment of southeastern Ohio became more diverse and lush and deciduous, with trees and such. And so consequently, the Archaic period, this heralds what is termed the Archaic period, and it signals, it's indicated by a broader, like a more diverse environment, which enabled them to eat a broader variety of plant and animal species. And this we know this by looking at the tools that they left behind. There's a greater variety of arrowheads, or what we term flint projectile points. There's more kinds of tools, like roundstone tools for grinding, and more importantly, the use of the adlatl as shown in that sketch up there. It's like a spear thrower. And then, it's just a cultural continuum. As the environment kept getting warmer, it allowed for more activity, different kinds of activities besides all subsistence. And late within the Archaic period, we see the beginnings of horticulture. They start to grow their own floral species, and they start to incorporate some rituals into their burials, and there are indications that they traded raw materials across the eastern United States. The Woodland period is signaled by even more mound building, more organized mound building. These mounds became, you can think of them as vertical cemeteries. There was an initial burial at ground level, and then they would cover that over and bury in increments. And some of them late in the period became quite large. And the ceremonialism was very heightened. They would trade. The trade network got wider. I mean, they traded to the East Coast, out west, to the Great Lakes, to Florida, for things like mica, copper, shell, and obsidian, to make the grave goods to bury with their dead. So there's more ritualistic activities. As again, that the environment became more hospitable. That we assume, and there's no tangible evidence, but I mean, we assume that they had some kind of social organization in order to be able to build the mounds, because somebody had to have the vision of what it would be and direct people to do it. That's just an assumption. We also see in the Adena period, the earlier part of the Woodland period, we see the beginnings of true agriculture, where they're actually starting to grow crop-like things like corn, beans, and squash. And again, the mounds in southeastern Ohio, the Woodland period in southeastern Ohio is just not at all like what we see in the Scioto River Valley. That's where you can go over to Chillicothe area and see a lot of the large Hopewell mound complex sites that are preserved today. I mean, you don't see anything like that. It's because of the topography over here. Ohio University over the last 30 years has had a very successful archaeological program, and they've really added to the agricultural or paleobotanical record in this area in particular. That and some of their research on Woodland Period sites has shown that they lived in groups which could be considered tribal in hamlet-like configurations. So it's different. It's way different. Late in the period, in the late Woodland period, and they were probably the descendants of the early and middle woodland folks. They seem to discontinue this heightened mound building activity and extensive trading, and they became even more focused on growing crops. The archaeological record in the late Woodland period suggests that they lived in large communities elsewhere in Ohio, not in southeastern Ohio, and utilized the Hocking Valley rock shelters quite extensively as satellite hunting camps, especially in the winter. And we know the time period of the year by the type of animal and plant species that are found within the shelters. And then the very last part of the prehistoric period, the Mississippian period, which is called Port Ancient in Ohio, they had larger villages, again, not in southeastern Ohio. And this is where we see large villages organized around central plazas. And these were kind of their base areas. They would have satellite upland hunting camps here in southeastern Ohio. And they didn't really have so much ritual in their burials as Hopewell. Instead, they were focusing more and developing more on kind of full-blown, if you will, maize agriculture than on hunting. They weren't really hunting and gathering so much. Their pottery was tempered with shell to conduct the heat through the clay. Is what tempering is. And they developed the bow and arrow, things like that. So they just became more and more developed. And this slide kind of shows the different prehistoric site types in southeastern Ohio. Again, these small ridgetop mounds. It's a 5-foot 5 human for scale, rock shelters, and a lot of their habitation sites, like I said, are
I
on
have it right now. I'm trying to
ridge tops,
adjust it.
small, narrow ridge tops.
It's found either, but but that's working off the second email I sent you, right?
Yes.
So these are somebody's got their
Yes.
somebody's
Thank
got their mic on. So thanks. So these are just to show the general types of prehistoric sites that we find here in southeastern Ohio. This slide was given to me by the current Wayne National Forest archaeologist. His name is Andy Tremaine. He gave me some stats on how many sites are now recorded on the forest, and I believe he said about 41% of the current forest ownership has been surveyed for heritage, and we've got a total of 3,236 sites of both, which consist both of pre-contact or prehistoric sites, historic age sites, and then on top of that there are sites that have both components on them. So thank you, Andy, for that slide. Keeps me up to date. All right. The contact period in Ohio is generally thought to be around 1650 AD. That means that heralds the beginning, or that marks the beginning of written records. In other words, 1650 is generally thought to be when explorers and frontiersmen, first settlers, that kind of thing, white settlers, got to the area and started recording, writing down what they saw. So that is the beginning of the written record. Just prior to European contact, the indigenous people were utilizing southeastern Ohio pretty much like their ancestors, the prehistoric cultures. They were living in large settlements west of here in the Scioto, Miami, and Bad River valleys, which is kind of north of here, where there were broad, fertile bottomlands that they could live in large villages and grow crops. And again, there's no archaeological evidence of large villages like this at all for this historic Indian period in southeastern Ohio. And so we believe that they were also kind of using this southeastern Ohio for hunting and moving around nomadically to hunt in satellite camps. This map shows the areas that the current tribal groups claim as their homeland. They went through a judicial process to do so. You can see that the Shawnee is very prevalent in the area, as are the Delaware. Again, this isn't meant to be gospel, but this is part of what they claim. It does not mean that there's nobody else down here in southeastern Ohio. They were also here, but these are what they claim as their primary areas. The dominant or predominant southeastern Ohio tribes were, as you see, the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Wyandotte, and also perhaps the Miami, which, even though some of their settlements were a little bit west of here, they were also here. And also the Potawatomi, the Peoria, and the Seneca, to a lesser extent, were living here in South and using southeastern Ohio, we think. This is also based on the information from the current tribes. And I just put a slide in here to show some of the more, you probably have heard of all these chiefs. I could not find very much information on some of the other tribes, like the Potawatomi, Peoria, and Seneca leaders. But in general, these were the again, the predominant tribes. All of these tribal leaders kind of fought together or worked together in a confederacy to fight for their homeland against the whites. All of them did. And then when they were defeated in 1795, I believe, 1794, at the Battle of Fallen Timbers by General Wayne, who is the person that the Wayne National Forest is named after, unfortunately. Anyway, when he defeated the tribes, then that they signed a treaty, and the only person in this slide that did not sign the treaty was Tecumseh. And those of you that know the story of Tecumseh and his life know that he never gave up. He tried, even after the Battle of Fallen Timbers, he tried to gather tribes together again to make a final stand, which he did until his death in a battle in north of here. So, but anyway, all of these leaders signed the Treaty of Greenville, except for Tecumseh. And this, I put in this slide, unfortunately, whoops, very sensitive. There. This is a slide of where the tribes live now and where their tribal lands are. They no longer call the land reservations. They call them tribal lands to them. And this inset, which is covered up by our boxes over here, unfortunately. It's this little northeast corner of Oklahoma. They were all removed by the government. There are no federal lands in Ohio at all because they were all removed by the government to Oklahoma. And this is kind of a close-up inset of the northeast corner, which is where most of our tribes that are from Ohio live, and they live together. They live next to each other, and they work with each other. You know, I was very fortunate while I worked on the forest to be able to work with them and talk with them quite frequently, and they have an active partnership with these forests in the east, you know, which they consider their homelands, to try to provide input in some of the management. So it's a very good thing. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the prehistoric indigenous first inhabitants, I will say, talk. And I just threw in this intermittent slide to show. This is a view from the Shawnee Tower. For those of you that live around here, you know where that is. Just as a placeholder in between talks. And so the next subject that I'd like to talk about is the Underground Railroad period in southeastern Ohio. And I was, again, very fortunate to study this time period while I worked for the Wayne National Forest, because we had two sites on forest land that allowed me to study that. I learned a lot. I never heard much about the Underground Railroad growing up in school because it wasn't a part of any curriculum, and I'm pretty sure it still isn't part of any curriculum in Ohio, despite lots of attempts by people that I know. But anyway, so what was it? It was an organized network of people that were strictly dedicated to help slaves escape the horrible situation that they had in bondage in the South. It was not a railroad, and it was not underground, but it took on the terms of a railroad. And so then it became like a code within the network. A conductor was a person who either hid slaves or escorted slaves to the next stop along the route. Stations were their safe places, often people's houses, but as you'll see, often communities too, where they could hide or rest during the day. They always traveled at night, of course, for obvious reasons, so they wouldn't be caught. And the slaves themselves were called passengers. So this took on the terminology of a railroad. By necessity, the routes of the Underground Railroad avoided cities. Where there were more people, they had a greater risk of being caught. And so their routes were often across rural areas in marginal farmland and wooded areas where the houses were few. This map is an 1898 map showing the routes of the Underground Railroad known at the time. And it was compiled by, move this thing again. It was compiled by, oh, there we go. I don't know how to change that. There we go. Done a lot of lectures in my career, but never virtual ones, so you have to be patient with me on it. This picture right here is a professor at Ohio State University, his name is Wilbur Siebert. He published a lot of material on the Underground Railroad it's considered fairly classic documentation of it. He based his research on interviews with either former slaves or slave descendants. And so he reconstructed the routes from that. And what always impresses me about this particular map is you can hardly see Ohio's boundaries here. I mean, it just looks like somebody threw spaghetti on it. And so Ohio was extensively used during the Underground Railroad period. And I think it may simply be a case of, here's the Ohio River, here's the lake. South of the Ohio River was slave, and freedom was up here. They weren't really free till they got up to Canada. So it's really the shortest geographic distance between a slave state and freedom. So it may have just been the geographic distance that resulted in this heavy use in Ohio. And there was a lot of activity, as you can see. These two stars indicate the two sites that are on Wayne National Forest land that the forest manages and that I studied for probably 30 years. But as you can see here, they didn't always go north. Sometimes they went south and west to Mexico, the Caribbean, that kind of thing. And of course, the discussion of the Underground Railroad would not be complete without the discussion of the atrocities that they suffered, the reason for the Underground Railroad. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, it is estimated that there were 600,000 Africans that were transported across the Atlantic to America, most of them between 1680 and 1810. That was kind of the climactic period of what is termed the Middle Passage. But the conditions were horrible. This is like a sketch of a ship where they were thrown in the bottom of these ships with very little food and water. Disease was widespread. The mortality rate was very high. And when they arrived, it wasn't the Garden of Eden. They were thrown into a world of abuse, physical and mental. They were considered property. They were bought and sold in auctions, like you see here. They were treated like livestock. So I mean, it's hard to wrap your mind around it. But I mean, if you think about it, 600,000 people were kidnapped from their home and brought in these conditions to another land and abused for like the rest of their life. So yes, this was the reason for the Underground Railroad, because people that knew were against slavery. Those who opposed slavery were called abolitionists because they wanted to abolish slavery. And the strength of the abolitionist movement was really in its diversity. There were, it wasn't all Quakers. That's a trope. People, that's what I was taught, or that's what I kind of heard in school. But it's not really true. There were free African Americans, and there were some religious groups, of course, but they weren't all Quaker groups. They were Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, that kind of thing. Native Americans, mixed, the mulatto people, mixed white and black. It was a diverse group that was involved in this whole movement. Anti-slavery societies and clubs then formed and often published newsletters and journals like is shown here to express their views. And of course, the North, and most of this occurred, the abolitionists were in the North, where legislation was passed to abolish slavery, and of course the South remained committed to preserving it because it was part of their plantation economy. This was their livestock that kept their economy going. And so this is a slide showing some of the more famous abolitionists in history. Probably a few of them you've heard of. Of course, John Brown, he was probably, I would call him the most radical abolitionist, if any of you know what happened to him. He didn't only just publish stuff and like newsletters and stuff. He put his objections into action, and felt really strongly about slavery enough to start an uprising. On the night of October 16th, 1859, he and a small band of his followers seized a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. The weapons they took were to be used by what he called his Army of Emancipation. They took 60 hostages and held out against the local militia, but were then attacked by U.S. Marines under the command of none other than Colonel Robert E. Lee, who of course was later the commander of the Confederate armies. So two of his sons and 10 others were killed in the fighting. He was wounded, taken prisoner. He was tried by the Commonwealth of Virginia for this, convicted of treason, murder, and inciting slaves to rebellion. And he was sentenced to death and hanged in December. So from October to December, didn't take long, but he obviously felt very strongly about slavery and the evils of it. William Still was born a free man in New Jersey, and he was a prominent Underground Railroad conductor and leading abolitionist in Philadelphia, where he moved to. And with little formal schooling, he managed to write a book called The Underground Railroad in 1872, which became a very important addition to the literature of the anti-slavery movement. Frederick Douglass, of course, I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have heard of him. He was born a slave in Maryland, learned to read and write as a slave, passed the knowledge on to other blacks in Baltimore, in the Baltimore area. And he's remembered as one of the greatest orators in American history. I mean, you should really read some of his speeches. They're absolutely mesmerizing just to read them, let alone to hear them. But he devoted his life to this whole thing. He freed himself, and following the war, he still worked for Freedmen's Bureau, the Freedmen Bank, held some government appointments. He was minister to Haiti and U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia. So he was a very revered man in his day. Levi Coffin, it was often called, he was another conductor. He was often called the president of the Underground Railroad. He grew up in an anti-slavery Quaker family in North Carolina and settled in Newport, Indiana, where he and his wife aided thousands of slaves. And it is said that none of the slaves that they helped ever were recaptured. And William Lloyd Garrison was born in Massachusetts. He wrote and published perhaps the most famous anti-slavery newspaper of the abolitionist movement, called The Liberator. It became required reading for any conductor or abolitionist in the country. And I put the next slide together because I always like to show the conductors themselves. We showed the abolitionists, then we showed the conductors, and these are the people that actually did most of the work. And I like to go from the nationally known to the most recognizable in the state to the local. Harriet Tubman, of course, everybody's heard of Harriet Tubman, I hope. She was also born a slave in Maryland around 1820. She was a house servant at about age 5 or 6. And she was to work in the fields later. And then she escaped. She returned over a 10-year period. She returned 19 times into the South and escorted over 300 slaves to freedom herself personally. And she was called Moses because of her skill at this. And she always bragged that she never lost a single passenger. One thing that you may not know about her is in some of the paintings and sketches you see her, she carried a big gun, a big pistol. And it wasn't for her protection and the protection of the slaves. She told the slaves that if they were captured, if they were going to be captured, she'd shoot them so they wouldn't have to go back to slavery. That's why she carried the gun. John Rankin was perhaps one of Ohio's most famous and active Underground Railroad conductors. His book, Letters on American Slavery, which was published in 1826, contains perhaps the first clearly articulated anti-slavery views west of the Appalachians. And this book, Letters on American Slavery, was also standard reading for abolitionists all over the United States by the 1830s. And he and his wife lived in Ripley, Ohio, and again, they, along with his wife and children, they assisted thousands of slaves to escape northward. It was also at his house that Harriet Beecher Stowe heard the escaping slave story that became the basis for her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. John Stewart was the lead conductor in the Underground Railroad settlement known as Poke Patch on the Wayne National Forest in Gallia and Lawrence counties. And he did an equal amount of work. He and his brothers helped a lot. Poke Patch was a major hub for northward routes. And so why was it so dangerous? It's because there were two fugitive slave acts. The first one, enacted in 1793, basically allowed runaway slaves to be caught in the states other than the one they escaped from and returned to their own like property. And then the second Fugitive Slave Act, which was enacted in 1850, basically tightened up the first one, making it harder to get around. And it also set up penalties for those aiding the slaves. That's the thing about the Underground Railroad. By this time then, it was so dangerous that, and that's why the research is challenging, is because they didn't write anything down. They were very secretive about the conductors and whatnot were very secretive about their work because they could be imprisoned, fined, they could lose everything they ever worked for, and sometimes they were killed by pro-slavery people. So you need to ask yourself, would I risk everything I've worked for in my life, my family, my life, my possessions, for this cause, to free somebody else, another race? It's a hard question to answer. This particular poster tells a story. It's for a slave. She was in her 50s, and she escaped on the Underground Railroad, crossed over the river, over near Marietta, near where our forest office used to be. And she made it all the way. They all made it to Canada, believe it or not. And so this map kind of shows the two sites that I've been mentioning that are on the Wayne National Forest. Site on the site is kind of on the border of Hocking and Period counties. A lot of the little cities, I know the little cities are familiar with it. The folks are familiar. It's called Payne's Crossing, and Payne Cemetery is really the only tangible piece of evidence for that settlement. The other settlement is Poke Patch down in Gallia, Lawrence County. They're very similar. They're now mostly archaeological. The houses and whatnot that were there are gone. It's a rural landscape now in both cases. But the church and the cemetery are both still there. In other words, the cemeteries are contain people who worked these settlements. These were not like cities. These were rural areas that were just geographic. They had geographic names. Payne's Crossing was not a town. Poke Patch was not a town. It was just an area known as Payne's Crossing or Poke Patch. And they both contemporaneous. 1820s, 1830s is when they were established. And they fit a purposeful pattern. This is a thing unique to excuse me, southern Ohio, and also southern portions of Indiana and Illinois. These settlements were called they're called by some researchers now farming communities, farming settlements. I heard a researcher, a keynote address last Friday on the Ohio Local History Alliance conference. Her name is Dr. Annalisa Cox, and she works out of Harvard. She studies this very thing, and she claims that before the Civil War, there were 95 of these such farming communities in Ohio before the Civil War. So these were set up by African Americans, free African Americans, Native American people. These were diverse communities that worked together, came from areas of Virginia, North Carolina. They moved here to Ohio to do this work. They set up these things in rural areas. They were just farmsteads on a rural landscape. The younger men, and this is part of the whole pattern, the younger men enlisted in the U.S. colored troops and fought in the Civil War. If you don't know what the U.S. colored troops are, you should rent that movie Glory and watch that. And sometimes they received support from adjacent abolitionists. Sometimes they didn't. But they were communities. They knew each other. They intermarried each other, and they were all over Ohio. People don't realize it. Again, this does not follow the generally held thought that Quakers were the people that ran the Underground Railroad. They really weren't. I mean, I had a researcher friend once by the name of Henry Burke, who lived in Marietta, We used to say if you were a free African American prior to the Civil War, you were involved in the Underground Railroad. There was no doubt in his mind that they were involved. This is an old 1912 topographic map showing this very thing. That this is the area of Poke Patch, and you can see that this is not a cluster of houses. It's just an area called Poke Patch Hollow. There's a house here, a house here. They were set up like this, with the houses spaced like this, so that they could more effectively move slaves from one house to the other. It was more effective than clustering houses, so that when the slave catchers came, they came to the same location all the time. And this is just a slide showing the men that fought in the Civil War and the U.S. colored troops that also came home, and they're buried, and they lived. These particular men lived through the war and came home to live in these settlements. So it's all part of the older men stayed behind to do the work of the Underground Railroad. The younger men fought in the war. They all lived this cause. There were some differences, though, between the two settlements that I studied on the Wayne National Forest, between Poke Patch and Payne's Crossing. In Payne's Crossing, there were 3 families that came in and settled first in the area, and they were the Normans, the Letts, and the Harpers. And these colored tracts show their property in the 1820s and 30s. They came and bought land themselves. They had money and bought the land and lived there and set up Payne's Crossing and did the work of the Underground Railroad. And one side note, if any of you watch that PBS show called Finding Your Roots, the Norman family who I've come to know let me know that Norman family descendants let me know that the show, they're going to do a show on the Normans. They have contacted the Norman family, who contacted me, and some others who study this for information on the Norman family. I don't know what famous celebrity or whatever they're researching for, but they are going to be showing this one segment on the Normans. I heard it was going to be in December or January. So anyway, it's kind of a neat thing. But the Normans were first there. They came across Virginia territory to Washington County to settle here. The Letts came across from kind of the same area, but into Muskingum County to there. And the Harpers, some of their family came from Belmont County to here. Poke Patch, when we looked at the land records for the Poke Patch area, we did not find individual owners. We found iron furnace ownership. The iron furnace industry was contemporaneous with this whole thing. It was a Civil War period industry, and a bit beyond. But so what this led us, this research led us into this connection between the Underground Railroad in Gallia and Lawrence County and the iron furnace industry. Basically, the iron furnace masters, meaning that they'd be like company owners in the coal mining area. Same thing. They had company towns. They had script. They had company houses. They built houses for the workers, set up very similarly. They were all abolitionists for most of them. Because the man who set up this whole industry in this area, he established Ironton. He started the iron furnace industry. This is John Campbell right up here. This very attractive man right here. He grew up with John Rankin near Ripley. So he shared these strong abolitionist beliefs. That's where he got it. And he moved to Ironton and set up the iron furnace, this whole iron furnace industry. And so a lot of his employees or people that he worked with in the industry who were owners of these different furnaces, there were like 40 some in Ohio, 40 some charcoal fired furnaces in Ohio. This is his house in Ironton. And I've gone through a tour of this. You can go up here to the top floor and look out these windows across the river to what was then slave territory, which was Kentucky. So he used to hide slaves himself in his house and in his barn. And he would have his employees move them up through the company furnace towns to Poke Patch, where John Stewart worked. And he was the leader of Poke Patch. Henry Hutchison was an ex-slave who also helped at Poke Patch. He escaped slavery in West Virginia, was recaptured, taken back to the plantation, and escaped again, and came to live then in Poke Patch. So these guys worked together, and it was John Campbell that really directed the whole thing. The students that used to work with me and do research called him the director of the Underground Railroad. And everybody probably knew in town that he was doing it, but he was so wealthy and he was like an untouchable. Nobody really questioned him too much. Very interesting history. I really got fascinated with it most of my life. So I thought I'd end with a few slides for Little Cities Council, because they promote Payne's Crossing and Payne Cemetery quite nicely. In 2010, we were able to establish enough of the Underground Railroad work of Payne's Crossing to have a marker, a historic marker put up to commemorate that at the cemetery. We also did, before we put the marker up that time, we got some of the Hocking College archaeology students to do some magnetometry of the cemetery. And what that does, it's a machine. This woman, you can't really, this is not a very good slide, but this is a machine that they run across the grid at intervals across the cemetery. And it picks up iron, it picks up the iron content in the soil. And what it did here, I don't know whether you can see this or not, but this was Payne Cemetery. This was the map that was generated from the magnetometry from Payne Cemetery. And you can see some shadows of graves right in here that we weren't real aware of. About half the graves in Payne Cemetery are not marked, by the way. So it's kind of interesting to see. And so we did stabilize the cemetery twice. First in 1995 and again in 2010 before we put the marker up. And I always say cemetery stabilization is really not that hard. It just takes a lot of brawn and machinery, in this case machinery, to lift the stones back up, to reseal them. These broken ones we finally gave up and we displayed them flat in a not necessarily concrete, but it's like a fine. They call it, the forest guys call it fine. It's real small gravel. When it becomes wet, then it becomes like cement. But these stones are pretty much preserved, the flat ones. These thin marble things you cannot display upright anymore. They won't stand up correctly. So this is a shot of some of the stabilization work. Some of these heavy stones we had to get a bobcat in to lift them up. And of course, this is the day of the dedication. And this was the second, like I said, the second stabilization and dedication of the cemetery. This was a rededication only. This one marked the installation of the marker, and the families came. The family descendants came. This is the Payne family. We had this lady is a Betts. This is Ada Woodson Adams. If you know her, she's a Woodson descendant. This is a Norman. We had a lot of Paynes. We had some Harpers. We had some Letts. This is Kathy Nelson of the Friends of Freedom Society, which they issued the Underground Railroad historic markers. So it was a glorious day, and you know, the best part of, undeniably, the best part of this research for me was knowing the families, getting to know the families, because they're just great people, and they really appreciated what we did. And there's the marker. It does get kind of vandalized. This is when it was brand new. It's a good shot of it. So I encourage you to visit Payne's Crossing. It's right on, or Payne Cemetery. It's right on 595, about 2 miles south of New Statesville. That's what I have. I'm finally finished. If you have questions, I don't know how we're gonna. Nikki's in charge of how we do some of this. I just kind of talk. But, if there are some questions that we can answer for you now, I'd be glad to. If not, we're going to have all the historians that are presenting are going to hold a Q&A session on Thursday night at 6. And if you submit your questions to the email on the website, then we'll, try to answer them and discuss them then. But if you have some now, all 2 people that are out there, I don't know how many people are there.
Yeah,
Anyway.
if anyone has a question now, please feel free to ask.
Yeah.
And if you have a question that crops up later, feel free to email us and we'll answer it during the Q&A. But we'll go ahead and take any questions that you've had during the talk, or anything you'd like to ask now.
And if not, we recorded this so you can watch it over and over and over and over.
Watch it at your leisure.
What, when you can't sleep at night or something?
Do we have any questions?
There's some things coming in the chat.
Okay, great. Yeah, we have from Tyler McDaniel. He said he's curious, how many unknown grave sites are in Payne Cemetery, do you think?
Well, we've never been able to figure that out. There are currently, I believe, 25 stones or 25 marked graves. And the only thing I can tell you is I've had people who live around there say, oh, that whole thing was covered at one time. So I don't know what that means. That whole thing was covered. But there are at least 25 there. I've always thought there were probably around 60, maybe. I don't know. Don't know for sure. I mean, and the death certificates, we have picked up some names from them going through the records, but not a lot. So there's still a lot of research to do. Plenty of work out there for anybody who's interested.
Any other questions before we?
Hello, Ann.
Yes.
My name is Robert Lett. We met way back in 2000.
Yeah, we sure did. How are you? Do you still live in California?
I am still in California.
All right.
And you are still in Ohio, I guess.
Yes, I am.
Yeah. Well, I want to, for all it's worth, from California, I don't have movies or any roles for you to play, but I just want to thank you for your contribution. And perhaps at your Q&A session you have later, I have a couple of names to add to your collection of Underground Railroad operators who actually worked in Belmont County and worked and they mentioned, I'll just mention this book. Beautiful Bonnie Belmont.
Hmm.
It is available online, and it is a story of Belmont County during the pre-Civil War era.
Huh?
And it talks about Mr. Campbell's as operators in that area, conductors, and also a couple by the name of Thomas and Maria Pointer,
Oh, cool.
who are connected with the Letts settlement, and they also end up in Hocking Valley briefly. So that's all I'm going to say, and thank you for today.
Well, I hope I represented your family. Okay. I mean, the Letts were very prominent in, I mean, I know Robert would agree, but the Letts were very, very prominent within the Underground Railroad in Southern Ohio. There was a whole Letts settlement over in Muskingum County, right, Robert? Muskingum
Exactly.
County? Yeah.
Right. But I'm
So,
going to add that the Letts and the Harpers and the Normans all become allied and intermarried families.
yes.
And then they all migrate to Michigan, and they do great things in Michigan,
Yeah.
as family. So
They just live their lives with this whole cause. It's,
exactly.
you take up a cause now and again in your life, but these people lived this, because they were that committed to abolishing it and to the cause of
That's great.
freedom.
And we had one question from Larry. Did the railroad go through Nelsonville?
I believe it did. I mean, Ada Woodson Adams grew up in Nelsonville, and I've heard her talk about it. I mean, the Underground Railroad was probably everywhere in Ohio. And it's, even though it's a challenge to research it, it can be done. I mean, there's ways to do it. I didn't know what I was doing when I started, but it was the people like Robert Lett and Kathy Nelson and the Friends of Freedom Society and folks like that taught me how to interpret what I'm looking at. I mean, because it really takes a cultural, and I've always said this, it always takes, Robert, we'll have to hook up again somehow.
Yes, ma'am. We would definitely have to hook up again. Yes.
Yeah,
And,
I'd love to talk to you and catch up.
Robert, we actually had
Yes,
a
ma'am.
question from Jennifer Hinkle. Her question is the book you referenced authored by John Salisbury Cochran?
yes, that's it.
There you go.
Hope that answered your question, Jennifer. Did you have any other questions for today? Or I'm sorry, Anne, did you have something you were continuing to answer?
No.
Any other questions? All right.
All right.
You did a wonderful job, Anne. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
And for anybody who wants to, we are answering more questions on Thursday during the Historian Q&A. So feel free to drop by. Thanks so much, and
See you then.
have a good one, y'all.
Thanks.